Hi guys, welcome to Wintellect webinars, and today we're going to be talking about understanding Azure Active Directory. A little bit about who I am. I am Blaze Stewart. I am architect at Wintellect, and I am a Microsoft Azure MVP, and I have a bunch of certs related to Azure technologies, as well as being a certified Microsoft instructor or MCT. I do a lot of work in the Azure space, so this is kind of my bread and butter. I'm not a particular Nazi about anything in particular on Azure. I kind of do a lot of broad things on Azure. I do a lot of different technologies there, and AD is one of those. So I'm excited to tell you about what AD does and how you can use it inside of your applications. So let's dive right in and talk about Azure Active Directory. Before we do that, let's just give you a brief overview about Wintellect. Wintellect, as many of you probably already know, offers online training as well as instructor-led training. So that's what most people know Wintellect for, as well as being the author of numerous books that are related to Microsoft technologies. We have many authors that work for Wintellect currently or have worked for Wintellect in the past and that have been published by Microsoft Press. One of the core technologies that we've written on is C#, and one of the most famous books on that was written by one of the Wintellect founders, that is Jeffrey Richter. So there's a number of other authors such as Jeff Procyse and John Robbins and numerous other authors we could talk about. But now we focus on our online content mostly for this kind of thing, and webinars are one of the ways that we do that. But also we do consulting work as well. So we are both consulting and training. We're a consulting firm as in the Microsoft space. We do a lot of work with Azure and app dev and Microsoft related technologies. And then of course our training component is where we bring an instructor to your company and train you on Microsoft technologies as well. So that's what we do. And if you're interested in these kinds of services, we will be glad to talk to you about those. So let's dive right in and start talking about what is Azure anyway, or Azure Active Directory anyway. So Azure Active Directory is fundamentally an IDP. It's an identity provider, but it's more than Azure, it's more than Active Directory in the cloud. So many times when a person is new to Active Directory, they think of Azure Active Directory as, oh, it's just AD in the cloud. And that's not exactly the case, because AD is fundamentally a technology that was designed for local area networks where everything was on the same local network and you could control it a lot more than you could when you have something that's in the cloud. And so Azure as Active Directory has a lot of the technology designed for that kind of infrastructure. Azure Active Directory doesn't really do that. It's more of a cloud-oriented type of directory that provides cloud services in a similar paradigm to what you would get with AD on-premise, but it does it in a more web-oriented way. So instead of using things like LDAP and Kerberos and some of these older technologies that are used for authentication, it's going to use things more like OAuth and forms logins and other types of technologies to do some similar things, but it's going to do it in a more distributed fashion, a more cloud-oriented way as well. So it's not strictly speaking AD for the cloud. It's actually more of an extension of what Active Directory does on premise into the cloud. And if you think about it in those terms, then that might help understand fundamentally what it does. So there's kind of two things that Azure Active Directory does out of the box. It's kind of its core competencies, if you will. The first one is identity management. And this is the primary one which most people often associate with Azure Active Directory. It's where you store your user information inside of Azure. So if you want to create any kind of user to have any kind of access to something on Azure, is fundamentally got to end up in Azure Active Directory. And there are other things that you can do with it that we'll talk about in a moment, but that's fundamentally what it's for, is identity management. The other thing that it does is access management. So access management is the logons, if you will, for those identities that are provided by Azure Active Directory. So if you think about the logon experience that you have with any kind of application, if you bolt up your application to Active Directory, typically what's going to happen is you're going to be able to use the same logon for a given application, be it something like Office 365 or some third-party application like Salesforce or something else like that. So that Azure Active Directory is the component of that application that's integrated with it that provides the access to that application. So these two things are what work together to complete the single sign-on experience, which really is what Azure Active Directory is trying to get at, but it's more oriented for the cloud. So first, I want to talk about in this webinar identity management, and then in the second half I'm going to talk about access management, and that's kind of the way I'm going to frame it. So if you have questions related to this, please pose those in the little chat section where you can put questions, and I'll be sure to get to those at the end of the webinar. And let's dive right into identity management, and we'll talk about a few things that you can do with Azure Active Directory here, and I'm going to do a couple of demos, of course, related to this, and we will go with that. So identity management is to provide the ability to do a single sign-on experience where identities are managed into a single source. So the idea of a single sign-on experience is, as I mentioned already, is the ability to use a single identity to log on to multiple different applications, even if they're not hosted inside of your infrastructure. So the idea here is, as we've mentioned, is using the same identity to sign on to Office 365 that you can use to sign on to manage an Azure VM, and the same one that you would use to log into something like Salesforce or SAP, so that you can do the business processes that you have baked into those environments as well. And in some cases, you can use the same identity to log on to your custom applications that you might have written that are integrated with Azure Active Directory as well. So the ability to have that single sign-on experience is what this is trying to get at by kind of pulling together an identity management solution where things are all the identities are managed in one place. Therefore, you can use that one place to sign on to multiple other applications, rather than having different IDPs or different access management for a lot of different things. Azure ID obviously provides its own integrated ID management. That is the out-of-box experience you get, but it also integrates with many other IDPs. Oh, an identity provider or IDP is something that provides identities. So Azure Active Directory fundamentally has its own, but you can extend it to integrate with other IDPs that might exist inside of your applications that you need. So a couple of ways that this is done is through something called Azure AD Connect. And this is the ability to take your on-premise IDs that exist in Active Directory on-premise, ADDS, or Active Directory services, that is going to be inside of your domain controller on a machine inside of your infrastructure, and you want to be able to sync those IDs up to Azure and back from Azure to your domain controller. There is a service that you can do to integrate with that called Azure Active Directory Connect, and we're going to look at this in a moment. I'm going to give you a little demo of that. Another way you can do it is by allowing other Active Directory tenants to connect to your Active Directory tenant on Azure. So with the ability to integrate with other tenants, you can have folks that have IDs that aren't in your Azure Active Directory tenant log into applications that are serviced by your Active Directory tenant. So this gives you some extensibility beyond the IDs that you're managing inside of your particular Azure Active Directory tenant on Microsoft's infrastructure. It also allows for the Microsoft accounts that might exist to log into your Active Directory as well. These would be like Hotmail accounts or Outlook.com accounts that folks have set up to have personal email accounts and all of those kinds of things as well. And the ability to hook it up to social media is kind of a new thing in Azure Active Directory, but this allows you to integrate with things like Facebook and Google. And so you can use Facebook to log into an application that is hooked up to Azure Active Directory. And we'll look at that in a little while later. And you can also use Azure Active Directory to integrate with other sources through federation like WSFed and SAML. And these are open standards that if they are implemented by another IDP, then they can be integrated with Azure Active Directory. One such one would be the Microsoft version of this through Azure Active Directory Federated Services, or ADFS. If you don't want to use something like Azure AD Connect, you can use ADFS and then get those identities from ADFS into Azure Active Directory through Federation if you don't want to go down the road of doing something like Azure AD Connect. So there's a couple of different ways to get identities aggregated into Azure AD with the ability to use the built-in Azure AD credentials as well. So let's go in and look at a couple of these that we have available to us. And I want it to look at mostly I'm going to skip this demo for now. I want to look at Azure AD Connect first, and then I also want to look at the external identities through a Facebook integration. So Azure AD Connect looks something like this. Azure AD Connect has the ability to take something. You say you have your Azure AD tenant, and then you want to log into something on your applications. That could be SAP, Office 365, Salesforce, your custom app, even Azure itself. And you want to be able to use your on-premise Active Directory domain services, ADDS, and you want to use those identities on Azure. And you would then stand up Azure AD Connect, and then from there, your users then can log in, they can authenticate against Azure AD using their domain credentials from Active Directory because of Azure AD Connect. And then when they log in, they can then log on to those applications there on the right that are integrated with Azure AD then. So the identities can exist both on premise and in the cloud, and it gives you a more seamless experience for your users as they log in. So let me open up an instance of Azure AD Connect here, and let me show you what this looks like. Let me get out of my slide deck here, and let's go into Azure AD Connect. So I have here, I'm logged into a VM where I have Active Directory already turned on. So I have here my domains and users. So this is like pretty much a plain vanilla install of Azure of Active Directory domain services. I have really done no customizations to this. So this is kind of I'm almost cheating here because this is very rare that you would actually have a more out of the box experience with Azure, with Active Directory on premise. Rather, you would have a lot of customizations that you might have to it. And I have here this new user right here. And this new user is one that I created. If I wanted to create another user, I could create another user here that would get synced up to Azure. So if I said Blaze, and then I said test, and I wanted my username to be Blaze test, and I go next, it's going to ask me to put in a password. I'm going to put in a password here. And let's say I can't change the password. And password never expires. And I'm going to hit finish. So now I have a new user here. Like if I were to wait for an hour, that user would eventually show up in Azure. If I wanted to force the sync though, I can actually come down here and I can come into Azure AD Connect and I can force the sync to run if I want to do that as well. So if I click on this little app here, this is a little app that you can kind of monitor what's going on inside of Azure AD with the tools they provide. So this is, that's not the one I want. There's a lot of applications that come with this. I clicked on the wrong one. Routes services, this one, synchronization service. So this one allows me to force a synchronization if I want to do that. So if I want to come over here and I hit run, this will force a full import, full synchronization. I can make that happen, and that will synchronize everything between these two. If I didn't do this manually, I would have to wait for a while for that user to show up. But if I run that, I see full synchronization here. That means that the sync happens. So typically there's a lag between any kind of updates between Active Directory on premise and what you do in the cloud. But if you want to force it, you can definitely do that. And once it's done, then you should be able to go into Azure Active Directory and actually see this user. So let's go in to my Azure Active Directory tenant, and let's see if I can find this. Let me pull up let me pull that up inside of a browser here, and let me log into that, my Azure AD tenant here, to see if I have Azure AD Connect user synchronization going on here. So I'm going to pull up Azure AD, and here is my users. The reason I skipped that first demo is because I'm pretty kind of showing that to you now right here. And so I have here users and groups. What I did is I created a new user, and if I have my new user, it should show up here somewhere. And it doesn't look like it has synchronized just yet. So let's see if I full synchronization success. It looks like if I have that, let's see, run that again. Let's do delta synchronization, and it's just going to see if it can actually get up there and to see if something will run here. And let's do this one as well, just to synchronize it, and for the both domains, and so that we make sure that we get both. I've got two domains hooked up to this. One is blaze.xyz, and the other one is me.onmicrosoft.com. And that one did a delta sync as well. And let's see if I have my identity yet inside of my, for some reason, it's not showing up just yet. So I don't know what the lag here is. But if we can come back in a little bit and we should see it. But to show you that I do have a identity here. This one is that new user that I did have in my directory. This is the new user that we saw when I looked at my Azure AD a minute ago. And if I come down here and if I look at my users that I have here, I have this user right here called new user. That is the same user that I have synced right here from Active Directory, Azure AD Sync. So if I come down here inside of my tenant, I can come over here to Azure. Where is it? It is under Azure AD Connect. You can see here that I have things enabled. I have the sync status enabled. My last sync was less than an hour ago. I have password syncs, password hashes enabled, and I have the ability to do the to sync things back and forth. I don't have federation turned on or pass-through authentication or anything like this turned on. And this is something that you can do for sign-ons if you don't want to have your password stored on Azure. What you can do with this is you can set up federation to have the logon experience be directed to some other IDP, be it on-premise through something like ADFS, or if you're using some third-party tool like Okta, you can use that as the sign-on for AD, and then also have the ability to manage the IDs through Azure Active Directory Sync as well. So those possibilities do exist through federation on this particular tab here. But in any case, the ability to sync Azure identities with your on-premise AD accounts is one of the features that you can use for integration with identity management. So let's just take one more look, and if I don't see it here, I'm not seeing it at all. So we'll come back in a little while and see if that user does sync up and if it does come back. Otherwise, we'll just skip over that part. So let's go look at our deck again, and let's pull this back up, and let's look at our next slide, which is external identities. So external identities are the ability to do something like we just saw with something like Azure AD Connect, but instead of doing it with an on-premise domain, we have Azure AD and we have our apps, and then we have external identities that are provided by something like Facebook or Google or WSFed or SAML. And so when we integrate these with the Azure AD experience, now I have the ability to do logons with something like Facebook into my Azure AD tenant, and then I can then grant access to my applications that I have registered inside of my Azure AD tenant. I want to show you the connection between these two first, and then we will look at an app registration in a minute that will actually use this. So I'm going to go over back to the Azure portal and take a look at external identities and look at how this works, because this is an interesting use case here. It's just another way to get identities into your Azure Active Directory though. So let's go back to our Azure AD portal, and let's come over here to external identities. So we just looked at our Azure AD Connect right here, and I want to get external identities right here. And so this is identities that are managed outside of my Azure AD tenant. So it's not a sync between some other identity store. This is actually using an external identity store rather than syncing with that identity store. So that's the kind of the key distinction between this and what we just looked at with Azure AD Connect. So if I come over here to all identity providers, I have the ability to out of the box configure Google and Facebook, and of course I can do SAML and WS-Fed IDPs as well. I have Facebook configured right here, and the way this is done is on Facebook is through an app. So if I come over here to Facebook developer, I'm going to go into the Facebook developer portal and show you the connection that I have here. I'm going to log into my apps, and if you look at my apps here, you can see that I have this app called Azure AD Integration. And this app basically gives me the ability to log on to my Azure AD tenant, because I just basically come in here, and then I have this thing called Facebook logon under the products, and then the settings under this, I simply provide it with an OAuth redirect URI. So basically this is using OAuth under the hood to integrate with Facebook. So this is the response URL that Facebook will redirect back to whenever the login is complete with a Facebook integration. And so once I have that, I can take the app ID and the secret, and then I can then plug that into my Facebook integration. So if I come over here and I look at my contact, if I just looked at this, you can see here, there's that app ID right there that I pretty much just got from this right here. I'm not going to show you the secret because that would kind of give it away, but you can see the app ID is the same there as the client ID I have for my Facebook provider right here. And then the client secret is, of course, that password right there. So once I have this set up, this allows me to create users inside of Azure Active Directory. Create users. It creates an integration user with Azure Active Directory. Basically, it's going to pull some of the properties off the user objects from Azure, from Facebook into my Azure Active Directory and create a user principal inside of Azure Active Directory. And I'll show you an example of that once I've got this. And we're going to revisit this in a moment because I want to show you the complete cycle of this, because we got to do something called user flows here in a moment where we're going to bolt this up to an application. So if I come back over here to my user identities, you can see here that I have this particular user right here. If I drill down into him, you can see here that you can see here that I have him coming from Facebook, and this is a user that I created by logging into Facebook, and then once I log into Facebook, this user's properties, including my email address and my name, got read off the user object from Facebook and put into my Active Directory. And so this guy does get a user principal, and it does get some other things that are related to this guy that are pulled into my Azure Active Directory, but fundamentally the authentication for this is handled by Facebook. So that is the way that you can integrate this with Facebook. Of course, the same principle would apply for other kinds of users that you can have with these external identities. So if I wanted to create an external identity for Google, I would get the user object from Google and pull some properties in from Google, or the same thing from the claims from a SAML authentication or WS-Fed IDP that you would do in that regard as well. So I set up Facebook for this one because the integration with Facebook is pretty straightforward, and you'd kind of do something very similar to Google. Doing this one's a little trickier because it requires that you have to set up a WS-Fed IDP that kind of speaks the language of what we have in Azure Active Directory. And the thing, my experience with SAML and WS-Fed is that while it's a general standard, it's not always feature parity between different IDPs. So it usually takes a little bit of a manipulation of the actual claims and some claims mapping between the two in order to get that just right whenever you're doing SAML. But because these are well-known objects that are coming from well-known IDPs, the integration is a lot more seamless and a lot easier to set up. The reason you would want to use something like Google or Facebook inside of Azure Active Directory is so that you can have these kind of users logging into your enterprise apps. If you want to create a more generic experience that is more for consumer-oriented apps rather than enterprise-oriented apps, this is not what you would use for that. There's another product called Azure B2C, Azure AD B2C. This is the ability to have a consumer-oriented Azure Active Directory instance. I'm not going to show you that today. It's a whole different video and a whole different demo. In fact, Winalec's John Garland did a whole series of blog posts on this, and those are wonderful resources for creating Azure AD B2C. It's a separate experience from what we're looking at here, but it has the ability to integrate with Facebook, Google, LinkedIn, Twitter. It's got practically every social network out there that you can integrate with a few clicks of a mouse, as well as being able to take your Azure AD and plug it into that as well. And that's for more consumer-oriented apps if you're trying to do like a mobile app that was oriented towards the general population rather than your enterprise applications, which is what this would be oriented to. So that's kind of the two differences between what this does and what Azure AD B2C does. So now that we've looked at the actual identity management, we've looked at a couple of the features and how it can integrate not only with itself, but it also has the ability to integrate with external identities provided by Azure integration through Azure AD Connect or through something like Facebook. Let's shift gears now and talk about the access management that Azure provides and how this integrates with a couple of different things. So this story is the ability to do app registration. So let's go back to the deck here and look at this. So there's a couple of things that we can talk about here. And that one is the ability to use Azure Active Directory for role-based access controls on Azure. So when we talk about Azure, most folks use Azure AD for a lot of things. Some folks use it strictly as the IDP needed to log on to something like O365. Then they never really use Azure itself for running their apps. But Azure AD, because it is kind of the first-party service from Microsoft inside of Azure, it's going to be what you're going to use to do RBAC on Azure. And by that, I mean, I'm talking about role-based access controls inside of your Azure tenant and inside of your subscriptions on Azure. And so this is what gives you the ability to have the access controls wrapped up around Azure identities. For developers, you can also integrate the access controls into your custom apps, as well as third-party applications as well. But for developers, there's a lot of tools and documentation available and for doing just this. I'm going to show you how to do this in a little bit too. And there's another service called Azure Application Proxy for many on-premise applications. So this, all three of these are different ways that Azure provides access management based on the IDs that it manages. So first you get the IDs into your Azure AD tenant, and then once they're there, you connect your applications to your Azure AD tenant so that it can provide access management to those applications. Now, of course, Azure being one of those, I want to talk about Azure RBAC and the integration that it has, because this is one of those things that some folks kind of get into Azure and they're like, what is this? And they're kind of scared of it because it's like all these different roles, but fundamentally it's pretty straightforward and easy to understand. So I'm going to talk about this for a minute. It's related to Azure AD, and I think it's because it has a lot of implications on how Azure AD works with Azure. So if you're going to be running your apps and services on Azure, you'll want to be familiar with these concepts as well. So you have an Azure AD ID, and you want to use that ID to log on to Azure with to manage resources on Azure. And there are fundamentally three roles in Azure. There's a reader, contributor, and an owner. And these different roles have different abilities. They can see resources, change resources, and change or create resources, and assign permissions to resources. And with each one of these different roles, you get a different level of access. So a reader can basically just see resources, but can't create or change or assign permissions to them. Contributors can see resources, create resources, but they cannot assign permissions. Owners can do all three of these. So they can see the resources, change and create resources, and assign permissions to them. And once you have these three basic roles on Azure kind of in your head, mapping these roles onto Azure resources becomes fairly intuitive, because basically you just say, well, do I want them to be a reader, a contributor, or an owner? And then you can also get down into some very specific resource-oriented roles, such as domain VM backup administrators, or Kubernetes cluster administrators or Kubernetes cluster users, and these kinds of roles that are very specific to a given resource. But these three roles apply to everything on Azure, and typically they're assigned to a subscription or a resource group that gives somebody the ability to manage an entire subscription or an entire resource group without having to get down in the weeds and assign very specific roles. So if you're kind of putting your toe in the water for Azure and you want to implement RBAC, first understand these three roles, then you can get more fine grained with some of those resource specific roles. And then of course these things have their own role inheritance. So if I had a subscription in Azure, which is typically the case, I might have a resource group and a couple of resources under that, and another resource group and a bunch of resources under that. The way that role inheritance works inside of your actual subscription is you'll have a role level that is set at the subscription level would be then handed down to the resource group level. And then the resource group level would then take it and then push that down into the resource level. So if I set somebody as an owner at the subscription level, then they're going to be an owner at the resource group level and the resource level itself. And then same it could be said true for resource group level. If I'm the owner of that resource group, I'm an owner of all the resources in that group as well. And then on down to the resource level and so you can see that this inheritance gives you the ability to create high level roles or get down at a resource level and create some fairly low level roles as well. So these are some of the role inheritance. Let's go over to Azure and just look briefly at RBAC here and talk about how this access management works. So inside of my tenant here, I have my identity. Say I wanted to assign a role to maybe this user here. Let's say a new user on this particular user right here. I'm going to get its principal so that I can assign it. So if I come back over here to Azure and I create a resource group, let's just create a simple resource group here. And I'm going to call it demo group, and I'm going to stick it in the East region group like this. And I'm going to stick it in the East region. Oh, that's not what I want. Back. New group. Come on. Get a little ahead of myself here. And create. And this takes only a second to create. And I'm going to come over here into my access controls for IAM. So this is where Azure integrates with my Azure Active Directory tenant. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to do a role assignment. So if I come over here and look at the role assignments, you can see that I have different roles, different contributor roles inside this already. If I want to add a role to this, I can simply come over here and I can say, do I want to select a role? The top three are going to be owner, contributor, and reader. And of course, you have all of these resource specific roles that you can talk about if you want to get into the weeds on all of these. But the main three that apply to everything in Azure are owner, contributor, and reader. And I'm going to assign an owner role to this particular user. So I'm going to do this right here. It's going to search for that user and I'm going to click save. And now this particular user is an owner on this particular resource group. So in theory, if I should be able to open up a new incognito tab and open the portal and log on with this user. If I can remember the password for it, that's the key. And I'm going to try it. There it goes. That's the user. And if I log on with that particular user, now you can see that I have let's see if I have my resource groups here. And there's my new demo resource group that I just created, and I signed that particular user as a owner of this. So I could actually assign IAM permissions to other users inside of this resource group as the particular user inside of this, as the owner of this resource group. So if I was a contributor, I couldn't do this. And if I was I could create resources, but I could not assign any kind of permissions to those resources. I have to be an owner to do that. And so you can see that I can come over here and add a role if I wanted to for some other role that I might have. I don't know. Let's choose this one. And then no members were selected. And let's select a role first, select a user, and then save that. And that is, oh, there's that there is that user that I just created from Azure AD Connect. It did sync up eventually. It just wasn't showing up in the portal yet. So there it is. I just assigned a user to that, and the password should have synced up as well. So now that I can come over here into my role assignment, I should be able to see that that Blaze test user that I just created inside of Azure AD Connect synced up to my Azure AD tenant now. So that just took a little bit of time to propagate. You can see that's coming from Windows Server Active Directory right there, and that's where the source of this particular user came from. So we did get that validation that that sync did work. It just took a minute to show up inside of the Azure portal. So this is the RBAC roles inside of Azure. So this is one way that Azure AD provides access controls for Azure. I'm going to show you another one though, that this one is related to an application. So let's come down here and look at our deck again and look at what we can do with this. So with the ability to do Azure RBAC, you can use Azure AD to control access into your Azure resources. You can also do app registrations inside of Azure, and this is for applications that reside outside of Azure. So this is for like your custom applications, for SAP, for integration with other third-party applications that you want to use Azure AD to log into. All of these different things are where app registrations come into play. And there's a ton of developer tools for this. Practically any framework that you can name will give you the ability to create these for this. So app registrations provide an easy way to integrate web apps and desktop apps and mobile apps, I didn't add that here, with Azure AD. And once you have that app registration set up, then even the aggregated identities from external identities such as Facebook, Google, WSFed, whatever those might be coming from, can now log on to that application. And I'm going to show you an example that I have here in just a moment of how that works. So that gives you the ability. Additional integrations from all these various other identity sources can now be used with your application in addition to the built-in identities that are provided by Azure AD itself. So let me launch Visual Studio here, and I want to show you a little demo application that I have set up with this. And I'm going to show you this little application, the code, and kind of where it plugs in. As soon as Visual Studio launches, because it's not hitting on all of, I do have a lot of stuff running on this box at the same time. So let's pull up pull up my app here. And this is a little web app that I have created for the sole purpose of demoing logging into Azure AD. So in this particular application, it's a .NET Core application. And what I have set up here is my application. I want to provide login controls for this particular application. So to do that, basically what I've done is I've integrated some Azure AD stuff here. I've got some configuration out of Azure AD from an object that I've got in a configuration file. I'm injecting that in to my application, and then I'm saying use authorization authentication in my application, and then it's getting the settings from this app settings.json. So this is all the stuff that I get from the Azure portal right here. So any application, and this is really what I want to show you here, is that this, once you have these kind of like 3 or 4 lines of code that you add into your startup file, this would be fairly similar to other environments with the SDK. And then I read in some settings here from a config file. I'm actually 90% of the way there for having authentication integrated into my application, because the SDK is going to pretty much do the rest for me. So to get this information, I first need to create something called an app registration, which I've talked about already. And to do that, I can go into Azure AD, and I can come down here to Azure Active Directory and come down here to what's called enterprise applications, or I can come down here to app registrations. And app registrations are the ability to create your apps inside of Azure AD, so that the Azure AD is aware of these applications, so that whenever a request is made with the credentials that are provided by the application, then it knows to integrate with Azure Active Directory, and it knows that, okay, this is already a trusted application by my Azure AD tenant, and therefore I can provide logons for it. So if I come down here and I search for my web application right here, I've already set this up using this. So I can just create a new application, and then I get the properties for this out of this portal here. I got basically I'm getting the tenant ID, which is this property right here, the client ID or the application ID, and then I'm getting some other URLs here. For my domain. So that's my domain right there, meblaze.onmicrosoft.com. That's the default one. And this is the instance, logon.microsoft.com. This is typically going to be this all the time. And this is typically going to be this all the time, unless you have a special case where you're not using Azure commercial. This might change. But this is pretty much going to be this all the time. And then you would get a client ID with your app registration, and you get a tenant ID with your app. That's your tenant ID for Azure AD. And then you put in your domain, you populate this object, and then your application is wired up and ready to go. But before we launch this and log in, I want to go in and look at how I integrate this particular application with something that we've looked at already, and that is the Azure Active Directory external identities, what we did with Facebook, because I want to be able to log onto this application using Facebook. So to do that, I'm going to come back over here into Azure AD. This is the application registration that I did. And so this is very easy to do. You just click new registration, you populate it, and this is where you could put in, I want to allow for external accounts like personal accounts from and other AD accounts, other AD tenants and personal accounts. You can set all this up, and then you have that redirect URI. And once you have that redirect URI and everything's populated, app is registered. Now to add Facebook logins to this, I need to go into my external identities and then use what they call a user flow right here. This is still a preview feature, so it's not intended for production applications yet, but it works as is right now. So it's working as of the last time I ran this demo. So that might have broken the last day or so. But if you come in here to a user flow, what this is basically doing is mapping on credentials, or really the user's properties or claims, as they call them in some cases, onto Azure AD properties so that you can populate these from things like Facebook. So I've got display name, given name, and surname, and I don't have any APIs connected to it. But if I come down here under applications, this is where I can connect my application to my user flow right here. So this user flow is connected to my Facebook identity provider right here, and then I've connected it to my application down here. And so that provides me the connection between my identity management using Facebook and Azure Active Directory and my application registration using Azure AD as well. So it brings all of that together in a single product. So it's doing my identity management in one case through Facebook integration, then it's doing my access management through the app registration. So with this, I can now log into my application using a Facebook ID. So let's go ahead and run this and see what happens. I'll cross my fingers and make sure the demo gods are with me today. So let's do this. Let's run this. And the first thing it should do is actually kick me over to the login page. I'm gonna take this though and launch it in an incognito window, because it's probably going to try to use some kind of cache credentials that I already have logged in. So let me launch a new incognito window here so I don't have any logged ons that are currently active. And it's already logged on to me as a new user. Let's go ahead and sign out, and let me close that other incognito window over here since I've already logged on with him. Right here, this is my other incognito window. Let me relaunch that new incognito window here, and so it'll wipe those credentials out, and we can log on now with Facebook. So it doesn't show up here, but if I go into the sign-on options, Facebook is lit up because I now have that integration with Facebook. And so I'm going to click on this, and now it's going to log me on, kick me over to log on with Facebook. So this is my demo user here. And so I got two Facebook accounts, one I use for demos, one I use for everything else. And if I click log on here, now it's going to ask me, do I want to stay signed in? And now it's going to kick me back over to my application using my Facebook identity here. And that's the principal that is assigned to me in Azure AD. So it's Facebook blaze.net@gmail.com. Now, this same user experience is what allows me to have a single place to put in my Azure, my application access management using Azure AD, as well as the integration with some of those third-party IDPs that we've seen with Facebook. And I could probably log on to this using my Azure AD credentials too. Let's try that. Let's log on using the one from that test user that I had. So Blaze test at blaze.xyz. And let's see if this will let me log in using this user, because this is the user that I got from my AD Connect, my Azure AD Connect. So let's log on to this one, and let's see if this will log me in. And there it did. It allowed me to log in using a user that I synced from Azure AD Connect into the same application. So you can see here I have two different one of them's kind of an external identity. With the AD Connect, it's still a sync process between AD on premise and Azure in the cloud. But then the Facebook one was a completely external IDP that I logged in using that login experience there. So here we have seen two different integrations with that particular logon experience. So this is the wrap up of this particular demo. I wanted to do a third demo inside of access management, but I don't have Azure AD Premium for my demo subscription here. I would have had to use a production one, and Azure AD Premium is not cheap, so I couldn't do that one for you. I wanted to demo application proxies, which is a really cool technology that allows you to do things like log on through Azure AD into something like an RDP session with Azure AD without having to expose a lot of infrastructure to do that. It gives you basically a browser-based experience for logging on to something like a remote desktop inside of a browser, and you log on to that using the Azure portal and Azure AD logon experience, like we've been using to log on to all of our different applications. But because of that, I had to kind of nix that demo. So so let's just hop right over to the questions now, and we can start taking questions and see what folks have. Just a few things to follow up. We will be posting this online into our YouTube channel, so you can check that out. And you can follow me on Twitter at @the1mule. I would love to see your feedback there. And you can also email me if you have questions, bstewart@wintelect.com. So let me open up the questions here and see what folks have asked here. We have a couple here, and if you want to ask your questions, please do put those in the question box, and so that we can get to those as we see here. Looks like we got about, I don't know, there's a good number of questions here, so that's good. So let's go to question number one. Is external identities the same as federation? Yeah, no. There's two kind of federations inside of Azure AD. Okay, external identities allows you to do federation through the external identities, which is basically like what we did with Facebook, where you're basically using the identities managed by another IDP that is integrated that way. And then you have the federation that is provided by Azure AD Connect, which is really doing the logins through whatever external identity whatever integration that you're doing. So if you were wanting to use something to log into your applications instead of using the default experience out of Azure AD, that the federation through something like Azure AD Connect would be a drop-in replacement for that. So in the event of my application that we just looked at, you would be kicked over to a login page provided by something like Okta or ADFS. In that case, if it was set up using the WSFed or the SAML provider inside of external identities, you could still use Azure AD, but you could also use those other IDPs as well in addition to Azure AD. So it's yes, it is a federation at the same, but it's not the same federation that Azure AD connects. So there's actually two kinds of federation available in Azure AD, and that can be a little confusing. But basically, that's the story there. Next question says, "What would you use for that?" I'm not sure what the context of that is. For that question, what would you use for that? I'm assuming that's related to federation. I don't know. Thanks. I'm okay. Not sure what that question was related to. Is claims-based access control supported? The is yes. Claims-based access control is not supported inherently by Azure, but what Azure can provide to your application is claims. So the claims object that's going to come through on a login, through whether it's through OAuth or SAML or some other thing like that, you're going to get a bunch of claims that are going to be attached to that, and those can be depending on the application and the requests that you have can be differing. And so you can send those as part of the user principal object, and that can be signed as well. And then you can use that to determine what access is granted by your application. So yeah, claims-based access control is supported. It's usually on a per application basis though, and you would have to integrate your application. And there's also something in Azure AD, which I did not talk about, that is called the Graph API, which allows you to do things like query Active Directory through an API to get claims out of it as well. That is an addition to what you can do with the standard logging experiences provided by something like OAuth or SAML or WSFAT or whatever those might be. So next question here says, is Azure RBAC always a part of Azure AD, or does it exist independently? Azure RBAC is part of Azure AD in the sense that it gets its identities from Azure AD. The reason I wanted to show you that is because the identities on Azure AD for Azure RBAC come from Azure AD. So if you want to use a logon with Azure RBAC, you have to get that logon into Azure AD first. So you could use Azure AD Connect or Federation to do that, but fundamentally that ID has got to be inside of Azure AD in order to use Azure RBAC. So does it exist independently? No, it's dependent up on Azure AD for Azure RBAC to work. So you need to have both your identity management inside of Azure AD, and then you get the RBAC by default because Azure AD is integrated with Azure already. So next question is on my a little project I have there. What SDK did you use within my project? I can show you that. It's just a simple NuGet package. In fact, if I come over here to my NuGet packages, it is the default one that's provided by Microsoft. Let me manage. Where'd it go? Oh, it's because I'm running. My application is currently running. I need to go to manage NuGet packages here. And if you look at my packages that I've installed, it's just the Microsoft ASP.NET Authentication Azure AD.UI. And this one has a bunch of dependencies that it installs, but fundamentally, this is the one that is used for most Azure AD integrations with .NET and .NET Core applications. And they also provide an analog library for languages like Java, Node.js, Python, and others out there so that you don't have to really do a lot of the complex work. You basically import the library, wire it up using something like this, and then it just works without a lot of code. So it's very easy to use. And that's one reason a lot of folks have adopted it, because it doesn't require that you have a whole slew of authentication schemes associated with your applications. And you can rather delegate that experience to Azure and let your application just have a single integration point, and that's with Azure AD or with Azure B2C. In some cases, Azure B2C is Azure AD B2C gives you the ability to log in LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, Google, even Azure AD if you want. It uses the exact same library. So you integrate Azure AD B2C with this same code, exact same code, and you would get the same sign-on experience, except you would be able to log in with any of those other IDPs that exist out there that are more consumer-oriented IDPs. So that's a very, very easy integration. That's why I like using Azure AD for my IDP, because I can integrate it with practically everything, or use Azure AD B2C if I want to create a more consumer-oriented application, because integrating that with my application is so much easier than trying to create an application that supports all of those and then having to maintain all that code. I'll let Azure deal with that, and I'll just write my code and integrate with Azure AD. Next question is, Is it possible to create a new user in Azure AD via an API? If so, when a company hires a new employee in HR software like Workday, that the Azure user can be provisioned automatically. Yes, you can do that. That's a very common thing to do. There are APIs for Azure AD, and that's a one very common way to approach that is to use those APIs to create users. And other people just do it in their Active Directory on premise. They use the whatever software they're using to manage users on premise, and then they use Azure AD Connect, and then it syncs it up into Azure as well. So there's a bunch of ways to do that. You can use APIs. You can use some tool to manage AD, and then have that sync up into Azure using Azure AD Connect, just like we can. There's a bunch of ways to do that. Let's see. Next question is, I don't get the exact use of user flow here. This is a question related to the user flow, the demo that I did with Azure application. In fact, let me pull that up in the Azure portal. A user flow is designed for, I know I kind of glossed over this, but what a user flow allows you to do is it integrates an IDP right here with the claims that are coming from that IDP. So it does a claims mapping. So something coming out of one identity provider needs to be mapped onto a claim from another identity provider. So that'd be a name, surname, email address, location, that kind of thing. So that's the first thing it does is it tells you what IDPs and what properties are you going to get from those IDPs and how are those going to integrate with Azure AD. That's the first thing that a user flow does. The next thing that a user flow does is tells you what applications you want to integrate with. So I want to allow applications A, B, and C to use my Facebook logon flow here because it has the ability to use Facebook. But application X, Y, and Z, I don't want them to log in with Facebook. They're internal applications. I don't want external users logging into them. So I would not turn that on for those applications. So it gives me the ability to not only determine what the flow, what the properties are, it also gives me the ability to connect different applications to as well. So that's what user flows are for external identities here. So it's basically the bridge between identity management by external IDs and access management provided by provided to an application. And that's the kind of the bridge between those. And that's what user flows are for. Thanks. Thank you. Great demo. Thank you very much for that. As an auditor, is there an easy way to identify the applications that are configured for MFA in Azure AD? I think you can do that. I think there's a query that you can run to tell you that if there's an easy way to identify what applications are configured for multi-factor authentication inside of Azure AD. There is a query that I don't know what the query is, but you can get that information out. Basically, kind of figure out where MFA is turned on, and then you would query it based on where MFA is turned on, and then you the list of applications. I don't know what the actual query would look like, but there is an API that you can get that information from. Next question is DeerSync the same as Azure AD Connect? DeerSync is the predecessor to Azure AD Connect. DeerSync was the first version of this. DeerSync is a little bit more crude and primitive in what it can sync. It was the first attempt at creating an integration with Azure AD and on-premise AD. It was the first attempt at doing that. It didn't have as much customization as Azure AD Connect. So if you're kind of doing this for the first time, don't even bother with DeerSync. Just go straight to Azure AD Connect, because Azure AD Connect has got a lot more configurability. You can customize what objects are synced up, what groups are synced up. You can filter the objects that are synced up. You can do a lot of things like that with Azure AD Connect that were a little bit harder to do with DeerSync. You can also control the schedule a little bit more. You can do a lot more controls over what gets synced up in terms of security, like things like, do I want to allow for password hashes and from AD up into Azure, or vice versa, or do I want you kind of get the picture there. Azure AD Connect is a lot more configurable and gives you a lot more tools to configure it with. DeerSync is a little bit more primitive, and there's a good chart. If you Google DeerSync versus Azure AD Connect, you can see the feature comparison. Azure AD Connect does everything DeerSync does and more, so you would want to use Azure AD Connect first and then use DeerSync, unless you're just kind of maintaining that for the last 5 or 6 years and haven't upgraded. So next question is where do you deploy Azure, the AD Connect? Is it on the Azure side or is it on premise? Azure AD Connect is deployed on premise on a virtual machine. So that VM that I looked at, let's see if I still have it pulled up here. I deployed Azure AD Connect on this virtual machine. This is also, because this is a demo VM, I installed it on this VM. This also needs a SQL Server database, and it also needs administrative access to your to your on-premise AD. So I installed it on the same VM because it's a demo, but if you're going to do this for a large domain, you would install it on a dedicated box with a more robust SQL Server instance in order to get this to run. I would not install this on a domain controller because it's very heavy because it does a lot of syncing between AD, a database, and what's in Azure. But once you install it on premise, on a virtual machine or on a physical machine, it connects up to your Azure AD, and you can kind of see the status in the portal, which we saw in one of the demos that we were doing. So that is installed on premise there. Next question is how can Azure AD use OpenID to connect to authentication as an authentication protocol, example for MFA? Okay, so that's a good question. Azure OpenID Connect is OAuth based. So what it would basically do is once you do your integration with your application, that is, say my web application that we looked at, my little demo app there, all the authentication is no longer a part of your app. So basically what you have then is the app just waiting for Azure to send some kind of claims object back. And so you're basically not doing any kind of authentication inside your application once you're using OpenID Connect. So basically what that does then is delegates all that over to Azure. So with your application, you can turn on Azure AD and OpenID Connect, and then you can in your side and integrate that with your application. Then in Azure AD, turn on two-factor authentication. So as part of the login experience, you would log on using your credentials, username, password, typically, and then for your two-factor authentication, you can use the Microsoft Connect, the Microsoft app to do the 2FA, or you can use text messaging if you have Azure AD Premium, and or you can do the the multi question type things for that kind of thing. And that would handle the two-factor authentication piece. And once that user authenticates completely on Azure AD, they're authenticated. Then what Azure AD is going to do is create the user object, sign it, and then send it back over to your application. And then your application can then get that application, verify the signature, and read the claims, and you're good to go. So you don't have to worry about the authentication protocol then. So Azure AD can use OpenID Connect through that app registration, like I showed you, and then let it handle all the two-factor authentication login, and then your application just gets the user object and then reads it, and then you're good to go. You don't have to do any kind of integration or management of the authentication in your application if that's the case. What's happening behind the scenes when an app registration is the same as a service principal? An app registration is okay, a service principal. This is a good question. What's happening behind the scenes when an app registration is an app registration the same as a service principal? An app registration is not the same thing as a service principal. An app registration is a kind of a container that has service principals associated with it. So whenever you create a service principal in Azure AD, really when you create an app service, an app registration, you're creating two service principals. One is the application principal, which is more robust, that can have roles assigned to it. And the second one is actually more of a user principal that allows you to log on, but you can't do any kind of RBAC with it. So an app registration is a service principal, but it's actually two service principals. So if you create a service principal that is designed for RBAC, you're going to end up really creating an app registration in that case, and you're going to get two service principals associated with it. Correct question. What's happening behind this? So with a service principal then can be used to do things like automation on Azure. You can do it for integration with things like Kubernetes clusters. You can do it for integration with your application and a number of other types of things like that. So that's a very good question. And the nuance there is that app registrations are both user principals for RBAC as well as user principals for non-RBAC roles as well. So because you end up getting two of them when you create an app registration. Fundamentally, it's not a service principal, but you can kind of treat it like one. It's because that's what it is. Next question is user provisioning for some HR system can provide provisioning for some enterprise applications such as Workday. Yes, you can do that. You can do that through Workday provisioning through the APIs. How do you manage external identities regarding MFA? You don't, because MFA with external identities is not going to be managed because with external identities, you're delegating the logon experience to an external IDP. In that case, something like Facebook. So if you have 2FA turned on for or multi-factor authentication turned on for Facebook is going to manage that. You have no way to enforce that with Azure AD. So if you want to use something like external identities inside your applications, you have to kind of understand the caveats of doing that. And multi-factor authentication is probably not going to be available for that. And so you would need to just to understand that it's not always going to be the case that MFA is going to work for external identities. However, if you're integrating with something like WSFED or SAML and those IDPs you have control over, then you can request 2FA be turned on for those. And that way you can ensure that the two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication for those for external identities is turned on, but it would not be managed by Azure AD. It would be managed by whatever logon experience is being provided by those external identities. Because you saw when I logged in with Facebook, that was using Facebook logon. It was not using my logon experience that I have out of the box experience that I have with Azure AD. Next question is there a user management UI library for Azure Active Directory that can integrate with a custom application? Yes, there is. I've not used it before. I know there is one. In fact, typically you can use that same library I showed inside my code to manage the actual user that's logged in. They can see their principal, and they can see their user properties, etc., using that library. The user management, there is a library. There probably is. I think there is. Don't quote me on this, but I think there is a library for that. I know there's an API for it, but there's probably a library for it as well. And you would have to go out to the NuGet to explore that. I've never bothered to look into it because most of the identity management that I use for this is done through the Azure portal or through some third-party app. In fact, it probably is because third parties are using it. So external tools for integrating with Azure AD exist. And so they are probably using some kind of SDK. If they're not using an SDK, there are REST APIs that you can use for doing that very kind of thing with. So that's the last question. So we've gone a little over, but thanks for hanging in there. I appreciate your guys' questions and thanks for being an attentive audience. We will be posting this on our YouTube channel. So if you want to get the questions, we can provide you with a link to that. Just pay attention to that. If you go to youtube.com/OneLikeNow, you can get access to that YouTube channel, and this will be up there if you want to view it in the future. And also, please follow us online. Check us out online at OneLike.com. And of course, we'll be having more OneLike webinars in the future. I'm looking forward to seeing you there. And thanks for coming. So I'll see you then.